Marshal Jake Sullivan had sworn an oath to uphold the law in Redemption Creek, Colorado Territory, no matter the personal cost. For 8 years, he'd worn the badge with honor, bringing justice to a lawless frontier town where might too often made right. He'd never wavered, never bent the rules, never let personal feelings interfere with his duty. Until the morning a warrant arrived with Elena Vasquez's name on it. She knelt before him now in the dusty main street, her sage green dress spread around her like the petals of a wilted flower, her blonde hair catching the harsh afternoon sun. The entire town had gathered to watch, merchants abandoning their shops, ranchers leaving their horses untied, even the children pressed against windows to witness what everyone knew would be the most difficult arrest in Marshal Sullivan's career. Because Elena Vasquez wasn't just another criminal to be hauled off to territorial prison. She was the woman Jake Sullivan had been courting for 6 months, the school teacher who'd brought literacy and hope to their rough frontier town, the only person who'd ever made him consider hanging up his badge for a different kind of life. She was also, according to the warrant clutched in his trembling hand, wanted for the murder of a banker in Denver. But what the good people of Redemption Creek didn't know was that Jake Sullivan had been conducting his own investigation for 3 weeks. Ever since the first whispers reached him about Elena's alleged crime, he'd been digging deeper than any lawman was required to do. He'd ridden to Denver, questioned witnesses, examined evidence that didn't add up, and what he'd discovered had shaken him to his core. Elena Vasquez was innocent, but proving it would mean defying his sworn duty and risking everything he'd built in 8 years of faithful service. The warrant in his hand demanded her immediate arrest and transport to Denver for trial. The badge on his chest required him to follow orders without question. The crowd watching expected him to do his job, regardless of his personal feelings. But the woman kneeling in the dust before him, looking up at him with eyes full of trust, despite the terror she must be feeling, deserved better than a justice system more concerned with convenience than truth. Jake Sullivan faced the hardest choice of his life: follow the law he'd sworn to uphold, or follow his conscience toward a truth that could destroy his career and reputation. As he knelt beside Elena in the street, his hands gentle on her face while the town held its breath, he realized that sometimes being a good lawman meant being willing to break the rules. What he decided in that moment would either save an innocent woman or make him the most wanted man in the Colorado Territory. Because choosing love over law in 1882 wasn't just about personal sacrifice. It was about redefining what justice really meant when the system failed those who needed it most. The jail cell in Redemption Creek had never held anyone Jake Sullivan cared about before. As he turned the heavy iron key and heard the lock click into place, sealing Elena behind bars, he felt something die inside his chest. She sat on the narrow cot with her hands folded in her lap, still wearing the sage green dress that had been dusty from kneeling in the street. Her blonde hair now pulled back in a simple braid that made her look younger than her 28 years. "Jake," she said quietly, her voice steady despite everything that had happened in the past hour. "I need you to know that whatever evidence they have against me, I didn't kill anyone." Jake pulled a chair close to the cell bars, close enough that he could have reached through and touched her hand if protocol allowed it. But Marshal Jake Sullivan had never broken protocol before, and he wasn't going to start now. Not with half the town still gathered outside, waiting to see how he'd handle his first real test of duty versus personal feelings. "Tell me about Denver," he said, pulling out the notebook he used for official interviews. "Tell me about Marcus Holloway." Elena's face went pale at the mention of the dead banker's name. "You know about Marcus. The warrant says you shot him 3 times in his private office on the night of September 15th. Says you were seen fleeing the scene by 2 witnesses. Says you'd been having an affair with him for months before his death." Jake's voice was carefully neutral, giving no hint of the turmoil churning in his stomach. "Says his wife received anonymous letters detailing the affair and that Holloway was planning to end it." "None of that is true," Elena said, but her voice carried the weight of someone who knew how damning the evidence sounded. "Jake, I never had an affair with Marcus Holloway. I barely knew the man." "Then explain why you left Denver 3 days after his murder. Explain why you gave a false name when you applied for the teaching position here. Explain why Elena Vasquez didn't exist in any records before she arrived in Redemption Creek 6 months ago." Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she finally looked up, there were tears in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. Because Elena Vasquez isn't my real name. My real name is Elena Morrison, and I left Denver because I was running from a man who would have killed me if I'd stayed. Jake felt his world shift slightly. In 6 months of courtship, Elena had never mentioned being married, never talked about a life before Redemption Creek that included anything more significant than teaching school back east. "You're married," he said, and it wasn't a question. I was married to Thomas Morrison, who owns half the silver mines in Colorado Territory, who also owns most of the judges, several sheriffs, and enough politicians to make inconvenient problems disappear. Elena's voice grew bitter. Thomas doesn't believe in divorce, Jake. He believes in making sure his property stays his property, no matter what the cost. Jake set down his pen, the official interview forgotten for the moment. Elena, if you were running from an abusive husband, why didn't you just tell me? We could have. Could have what? Protected me from a man who has more money and influence than the territorial governor? A man who's already proven he can frame people for crimes they didn't commit? Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. Jake, I didn't kill Marcus Holloway, but Thomas Morrison did, and he made sure I'd take the blame for it. The pieces began clicking together in Jake's mind, forming a picture that made his blood run cold. Holloway was your husband's business partner? More than that. Marcus was the only person who knew the truth about some of Thomas's less legal business dealings. Mining claims that weren't properly filed, or shipments that disappeared from the books. Workers who died in accidents when they started asking too many questions about safety conditions. Elena gripped the bars of her cell, her knuckles white. Marcus had been Thomas's accountant for 10 years before he became a banker. He knew where all the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively. Jake reopened his notebook, but this time he was writing down Elena's words instead of the questions from his official script. So Morrison killed Holloway to keep him quiet and framed you for it to get rid of two problems at once. Thomas knew I'd been talking to Marcus about getting help to leave my marriage safely. Not romantically, just a frightened woman asking an old family friend for advice. But Thomas made it look like an affair, complete with forged love letters and paid witnesses who swore they'd seen us together. Elena's voice cracked slightly. He even arranged for me to be in the right place at the right time on the night Marcus died. Sent me a message saying Marcus needed to see me urgently about helping me escape. When I arrived at the bank, I found Marcus dead and two of Thomas's men waiting to witness my flight from the scene. Jake felt rage building in his chest. Not at Elena, but at the system that would allow a rich man to manipulate evidence and by testimony to destroy an innocent woman's life. Why didn't you go to the authorities in Denver? Tell them what really happened? With what proof? Against Thomas Morrison? Elena shook her head sadly. Jake, half the Denver police force owes their jobs to political appointments Thomas influenced. The territorial judge who issued my arrest warrant plays poker with Thomas every Tuesday night. The prosecutor who's building the case against me borrowed money from Thomas's bank to buy his house. And the two witnesses who saw you fleeing the scene work for Thomas, have worked for him for years. They'd swear I was the devil himself if Thomas paid them enough. Elena leaned back against the wall, looking suddenly exhausted. I ran because staying would have meant a trial I couldn't win, followed by a hanging for a crime I didn't commit. At least running gave me 6 months of freedom, 6 months of feeling like a human being instead of property. Jake closed his notebook and studied Elena's face, looking for any sign of deception. In 8 years of law enforcement, he'd learned to read people, to spot the tells that separated truth from lies. But everything in Elena's expression, her body language, the way she held his gaze without flinching, it all spoke of someone telling the truth, no matter how incredible that truth might sound. Elena, I need you to understand something. Even if everything you're telling me is true, I don't have any proof. No evidence that would hold up in court. No way to prove Thomas Morrison framed you or that the witnesses against you are lying. I know, she said quietly. I've known since the moment I saw that warrant that this was the end of the road. I just hoped. She trailed off, looking out the small barred window toward the street where normal life was continuing. I hoped I'd have more time to teach the children, more time to feel like I belong somewhere, More time to... She looked at him with eyes full of pain and regret. More time to see if what was growing between us was real. Jake stood abruptly, pacing to the far wall of the small jail office. Everything Elena had told him matched the inconsistencies he'd noticed during his unofficial investigation in Denver. The witnesses who'd been too eager to talk, too perfectly prepared with their testimony. The evidence that seemed almost theatrical in how neatly it painted Elena as a jealous lover driven to murder. The complete lack of any physical evidence placing her at the scene beyond the paid testimonies. But knowing someone was innocent and proving it in a court of law were two entirely different things. Jake, Elena said softly, I need you to know that I don't blame you for this. You took an oath to uphold the law, and that's what you're doing. You're a good man and a good marshal. Don't let what happens to me change that. Jake turned back to face her, seeing the woman who'd brought joy and purpose to his life, who'd made him think about building something more than just a career in law enforcement. She was telling him it was acceptable to choose duty over conscience, law over love. But as he looked at her, sitting in that cell, facing a death sentence for a crime he knew in his gut she didn't commit, Jake Sullivan realized that being a good marshal might require him to break every rule he'd ever followed. The question was, did he have the courage to throw away 8 years of honorable service to save the woman he loved? And more importantly, could he live with himself if he didn't? Outside, storm clouds were gathering over Redemption Creek, promising a reckoning that would test more than just the weather's fury. Jake Sullivan didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office chair, staring at Elena through the bars of her cell, watching her fitful rest and wondering how many more nights she had left to sleep at all. The warrant on his desk demanded her transport to Denver within 48 hours. In less than 2 days, he'd have to put her on a stagecoach that would carry her to a trial that was nothing more than an elaborate execution, unless he did something about it. The idea had been growing in his mind since their conversation ended, taking root like a weed that refused to be pulled. Jake Sullivan had spent 8 years building a reputation as a lawman who never bent the rules, never showed favoritism, never let personal feelings interfere with his duty. But sitting here in the lamplight, watching the woman he loved prepare to die for another man's crime, he realized that sometimes being a good marshal meant being willing to become a bad one. At 3 a.m, Jake made his decision. He rose quietly from his chair, moving with the careful stealth he'd learned, tracking outlaws through the Colorado mountains. Elena stirred as his shadow crossed her cell, her eyes opening to find him studying the lock mechanism with the focused intensity of a man planning something dangerous. "Jake?" she whispered, sitting up on the narrow cot. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled out his ring of keys and selected the one that would open her cell. But instead of using it, he set the entire ring on his desk and walked to the gun rack where he kept his personal weapons. A Winchester rifle, a Colt 45, and the shotgun he'd used to face down the Carver gang 2 summers ago. "I'm thinking about Thomas Morrison," Jake said quietly, checking the loads in his pistol. "I'm thinking about a system that allows rich men to buy justice while innocent people hang for crimes they didn't commit. And I'm thinking that maybe it's time someone reminded folks in Denver that the law is supposed to protect people, not just property." Elena was fully awake now, alarm clear in her voice. "Jake, no. Whatever you're planning, don't throw your career away for me. I'm not worth it." He turned to face her then, his eyes blazing with something she'd never seen before. Not just love, but righteous fury at the injustice being done to her. "Elena, you're the only thing in this town that is worth it. These people elected me to keep them safe from criminals, not to deliver innocent women to be murdered by the law. But if you help me escape, you'll be wanted for aiding a fugitive. You'll lose everything you've worked for." Jake holstered his gun and picked up the keys again, this time moving toward her cell with determined purpose. "I've already lost everything that matters. The badge doesn't mean anything if I can't use it to protect the people who deserve protection." But as he reached for the lock, a sound from outside stopped him cold. The unmistakable rhythm of multiple horses approaching at speed. Jake's hand froze on the key as he counted the hoofbeats. 6 horses, maybe 7, coming fast down the main street toward the jail. At 3 o'clock in the morning, that could only mean one thing: trouble. "Stay quiet," he whispered to Elena, moving to the window and peering through the gap in the curtains. What he saw made his blood turn to ice water. 7 riders in dark coats were dismounting in front of his jail, their movements coordinated and professional. These weren't local cowboys or drifters passing through. These were hired guns, the kind of men who worked for people rich enough to buy silence with bullets. And leading them was a face Jake recognized from the wanted posters in his desk drawer. Kurt Rawlings, a killer who hired out to mining interests throughout the territory. The door to the jail rattled as someone tested the handle, followed by a sharp knock that wasn't really asking permission to enter. "Marshal Sullivan," a voice called from outside. "We need to have a conversation about your prisoner." Jake's mind raced as he assessed the situation. 7 professional killers outside, Elena trapped in a cell, and him with no backup and no legal authority to refuse their demand to see the prisoner. Morrison had decided not to wait for the slow wheels of territorial justice. He was going to end this tonight, permanently. "Jake," Elena whispered, her face pale with terror, "those are Thomas's men. He's not taking any chances that I might survive a trial." "They'll have to go through me first," Jake said grimly, moving away from the window and taking position behind his desk where he had cover and clear lines of sight to both the door and Elena's cell. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Marshal, we know you're in there. We just want to talk. Make this easy on everyone." Jake called back, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Come back in the morning with proper paperwork. Visiting hours are over." A different voice answered, one that carried the cold authority of a man used to getting what he wanted. "Marshal Sullivan, my name is Curtis Rawlings. I represent certain business interests in Denver who have concerns about the security of your prisoner. We're not here to cause trouble, but we are here to ensure that Elena Morrison doesn't have the opportunity to spread lies about respectable people." Elena Morrison, not Vasquez. They weren't even pretending she was anything other than Thomas Morrison's property. "The prisoner is secure," Jake called back. "She'll be transported to Denver as scheduled." "See, Marshal, that's where we have a problem," Rawlings replied. "My employer doesn't trust the territorial justice system to handle this matter appropriately. Too many ways for clever lawyers to twist the truth. Too many opportunities for a desperate woman to make wild accusations against innocent people. Better to resolve this situation quietly, right here in Redemption Creek." Jake looked at Elena, seeing his own understanding reflected in her eyes. They weren't here to transport her to Denver for trial. They were here to kill her and make it look like she died trying to escape custody. Maybe kill him too, if he got in the way. The choice that had been forming in Jake's mind all night crystallized into absolute clarity. He could follow protocol, open the door, and let Morrison's hired killers murder an innocent woman in his jail. Or he could remember why he'd pinned on a badge in the first place, to stand between decent people and the predators who would prey on them. Jake Sullivan had spent 8 years being a good marshal according to the letter of the law. Tonight he was going to be a good marshal according to his conscience. "Elena," he said quietly, pulling out his keys and moving toward her cell, "I need you to trust me." "Jake, they'll kill you." "Maybe, but they'll have to catch us first." He unlocked her cell door and pushed it open. "There's a back door that leads to the alley behind the jail. My horse is in the stable 2 buildings down. Can you ride?" "Yes, but..." "No buts. When I give the signal, you run for that back door and don't look back, no matter what happens. I'll be right behind you." Outside, Rawlings was growing impatient. "Marshal, you've got 30 seconds to open this door voluntarily. After that, we're coming in anyway, and things might get messy." Jake handed Elena his spare pistol, a small derringer he kept for emergencies. "Do you know how to use this?" She took the weapon with steady hands. "Thomas made sure I learned. He said a woman in mining country needed to know how to protect herself from the kind of men who worked the claims." Her laugh was bitter. "I never imagined I'd need protection from my own husband's hired killers." 20 seconds, Marshal." Jake blew out the oil lamp, plunging the jail into darkness. Elena's hand found his in the blackness, squeezing once before letting go. Outside, he could hear the men positioning themselves around the building, some at the front door, others moving to cover the windows. Professional tactics from professional killers. But Jake Sullivan had spent 8 years learning every inch of Redemption Creek, every alley and rooftop and hidden path through the buildings. If they were going to turn him into an outlaw, he was going to be the kind of outlaw these hired guns would never forget. "Time's up, Marshal." The front door exploded inward as two men hit it simultaneously with rifle butts. Jake was already moving, grabbing Elena's hand and pulling her toward the back exit as gunfire erupted behind them. Bullets splintered the wooden walls of the jail, but Jake and Elena were already through the rear door and running into the night. Behind them, shouts of anger and confusion filled the air as Rawlings and his men realized their quarry had escaped. Within seconds, they'd be spreading out to search every building, every shadow, every possible hiding place in town. Jake Sullivan, Marshal of Redemption Creek, was now officially a fugitive from the law he'd sworn to uphold. And somehow, running through the darkness with Elena's hand in his, he'd never felt more like he was doing his job properly. The real chase was just beginning. The alley behind the jail reeked of horse manure and rotting vegetables, but to Jake it smelled like freedom. He pressed himself against the back wall of Murphy's General Store, Elena's breathing harsh in his ear as they listened to the chaos erupting from the jail behind them. Rawlings was shouting orders to his men, their boots thundering across the wooden floors as they searched every corner of the building that had become their trap instead of Elena's tomb. "They're gone!" one of the hired guns called out. "Back doors wide open." "Then find them," Rawlings snarled. "Morrison's paying us enough to buy half of Colorado territory. Don't make me explain to him how we let a small-town marshal and a woman disappear into thin air." Jake pulled Elena deeper into the shadows between the buildings, his hand on his gun as he calculated their next move. The stable where his horse waited was 50 yards away, across an open space lit by the half-moon above. 50 yards that might as well have been 50 miles if Rawlings posted sentries at the right positions. "Jake," Elena whispered urgently, "there's something I need to tell you before we go any further. Something that might change your mind about helping me." He looked at her in the dim moonlight, seeing fear in her eyes that went deeper than just the hired killers hunting them. "Elena, whatever it is can wait until we're safe." "No, it can't." Her grip on his arm tightened. "Because if we're caught, if they take me back, you need to know the whole truth about what Thomas Morrison is capable of. You need to know why Marcus Holloway really died." From the jail came the sound of men organizing search parties. Jake could hear Rawlings dividing his crew, sending them to cover the main streets and likely escape routes. They had maybe 2 minutes before the net closed around them completely. "Tell me," Jake said, because something in Elena's voice told him this was important enough to risk those precious seconds. Elena took a shaky breath. Marcus Holloway didn't just know about Thomas's illegal mining operations. He knew about the children. Jake felt ice form in his stomach. "What children?" "The orphans Thomas was bringing in from back east to work the mines. 12, 13, 14 years old, some even younger. He told people he was providing them opportunities, giving them jobs and education. But he was working them in the most dangerous tunnels for pennies a day, and when they got sick or injured," Elena's voice broke. "When they got sick or injured, they just disappeared." The magnitude of Morrison's evil hit Jake like a physical blow. Child labor was bad enough, but murder? How many? Marcus had records going back 5 years, at least 30 children, maybe more. Thomas has been systematically murdering child workers to keep his labor costs down and avoid having to pay medical expenses. Tears were streaming down Elena's face now. Marcus couldn't live with keeping those records secret anymore. He was going to take them to the territorial authorities, expose everything. That's why Thomas killed him, and that's why he's so desperate to make sure I never make it to trial. Because I know where Marcus hid copies of those records. Jake stared at her, understanding now why Morrison had sent professional killers instead of trusting the legal system. A man who murdered children for profit wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who threatened to expose him. "Where are the records?" Jake asked. "Hidden in Denver. Marcus gave me a key and told me where to find them if anything happened to him. I was supposed to take them to a federal marshal he trusted, someone outside of Thomas's influence. But then Marcus was killed, and I had to run before I could retrieve them." A shout from nearby cut their conversation short. One of Rawlings' men was moving down the alley, checking every shadow and doorway. Jake drew his pistol, motioning for Elena to stay behind him as the searcher approached their hiding spot. The man was young, probably no older than 25, with the nervous energy of someone trying to prove himself worthy of the money Morrison was paying. He carried his rifle like he knew how to use it, but he moved with the overconfidence of someone who'd never faced a real gunfighter. As the searcher passed their position, Jake stepped out of the shadows behind him. "Looking for someone?" he asked quietly. The young man spun around, trying to bring his rifle to bear, but Jake was already moving. The butt of his Colt connected with the side of the man's head with a solid thunk, and the would-be killer crumpled to the ground without a sound. "Is he?" Elena started to ask. "Just sleeping," Jake assured her, already stripping the unconscious man of his rifle and ammunition. "But he won't be out long. We need to move." They crept through the maze of alleys and back lots that Jake knew as well as his own reflection. Past the blacksmith shop where old Henrik kept his forge burning late into the night, around the back of the saloon where he'd broken up countless fights, through the gap between buildings that only locals knew existed. Every step took them further from the jail and closer to the stable where salvation waited in the form of Jake's reliable bay gelding. But as they approached the stable, Jake's heart sank. Two of Rawlings' men were already there, rifles ready, obviously having had the same thought about where fugitives might try to steal horses. The stable was a trap now, just like everything else in town. "They're everywhere," Elena whispered, peering around the corner of the last building between them and their escape route. Jake studied the situation, his mind racing through alternatives. They needed horses, needed to get out of Redemption Creek before Rawlings could organize a proper manhunt with the help of the townspeople. But every obvious route was already blocked by professional killers who knew their business. Then he remembered something that made him smile grimly in the darkness. "Elena, how do you feel about stealing from the church?" She looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. "What?" "Reverend Patterson keeps his buggy horse in a shed behind the church. It's not much of a mount, but it's transportation, and it's the one place in town these killers won't think to check first." Jake was already moving, leading her through another series of back alleys toward the white-painted church at the edge of town. Professional gun hands tend to avoid holy ground when they're conducting unholy business. The church sat on a small rise overlooking Redemption Creek's main street, its steeple pointing toward stars that seemed to mock the violence playing out below. Behind it, a small shed housed Reverend Patterson's elderly mare, a gentle creature named Grace, who'd carried the preacher on his rounds to outlying homesteads for the better part of a decade. "She's not exactly a war horse," Jake admitted as he quickly saddled the mare, "but she's quiet and she knows the mountain trails better than most horses half her age." Elena ran her hands along Grace's neck, and the old mare nickered softly in response. "She'll do fine. Thomas's men will be looking for a marshal's horse, not a preacher's buggy nag." As Jake finished with the saddle, Elena suddenly grabbed his arm. "Jake, wait! Before we leave town, there's something else. Marcus didn't just hide those records in Denver. He sent copies to someone here in Redemption Creek, someone he trusted to keep them safe until the right time came to use them." Jake stared at her. "Who?" "I don't know. He never told me. He just said that if anything happened to him, I should find someone in this town who knew the difference between law and justice and tell them about the children." Elena's eyes searched his face. "I think he might have meant you, Jake. I think Marcus Holloway was counting on an honest lawman to finish what he started." The implications hit Jake like a thunderbolt. If those records were already in Redemption Creek, if someone in town was already holding the evidence that could destroy Morrison and bring justice for 30 murdered children, then running away might not be the answer. Maybe the answer was finding those records and making sure they reached someone who could use them. But first, they had to survive the night. A sound from the direction of the main street caught Jake's attention. Horses moving at a gallop, more riders arriving in town. Through the darkness, he could make out a group of at least 10 more men, all armed, all moving with the same professional efficiency as Rawlings' original crew. "Morrison must have sent every gun hand in Colorado territory," Jake muttered, helping Elena mount behind him on Grace's broad back. "He's not taking any chances." As they prepared to ride out, Elena's arms tightened around his waist. "Jake, I need you to know something." Whatever happens next, these past 6 months in Redemption Creek have been the happiest of my life. For the first time since I married Thomas, I felt like a person instead of just property. You gave me that. Jake reached back to squeeze her hand. Then we're going to make sure you keep feeling that way. Thomas Morrison has taken enough from you, Elena. He's not taking your life too. They rode out quietly, Grace's hoofbeats muffled by the soft earth behind the church. As they crested the hill that overlooked Redemption Creek, Jake took one last look at the town he'd served for 8 years. Lanterns were being lit in windows as the commotion drew people from their beds. Soon every citizen would know that their marshal had broken the law to protect a wanted murderer, that the man they'd trusted to keep them safe had chosen love over duty. But looking down at the chaos Rawlings' men were creating as they searched every building, every hiding place, every shadow in town, Jake realized something important. He wasn't betraying the people of Redemption Creek by helping Elena escape. He was protecting them from the kind of men who would murder children for money and frame innocent women for crimes they didn't commit. Thomas Morrison had made one critical mistake. He'd assumed that Jake Sullivan was just another lawman who could be bought, intimidated, or eliminated. But Jake Sullivan had spent 8 years learning that sometimes the most important law wasn't written in any book. It was written in the human heart, in the simple understanding that some things were worth risking everything to protect. As they disappeared into the darkness of the Colorado mountains, Jake could hear Rawlings shouting orders to his expanded crew of killers. The manhunt was about to begin in earnest, and Jake knew they'd have professional trackers on their trail by dawn. But for the first time since that warrant had arrived with Elena's name on it, Jake Sullivan felt like he was doing exactly what a good marshal should do. The hard part would be staying alive long enough to prove it. Dawn broke cold and gray over the Colorado Rockies, painting the mountain peaks in shades of steel and shadow. Jake had pushed Grace hard through the night, following deer trails and mining paths that most men would never find, let alone navigate in darkness. The old mare had proven her worth, picking her way through rocky terrain with the sure-footedness that came from years of carrying Reverend Patterson to remote homesteads and mining camps. But even Grace couldn't outrun professional trackers forever. Jake reined in the tired horse at a rocky outcropping that provided both shelter and a clear view of the valley below. Elena had dozed fitfully against his back during the hard ride, but now she was fully awake, her arms tight around his waist as she peered over his shoulder at the ominous sight unfolding in the distance. At least 15 riders were spread across the valley floor in a perfect search formation, moving with the methodical precision of men who hunted other men for a living. Even at this distance, Jake could make out the distinctive black coat and silver-trimmed hat of Curtis Rawlings, the killer directing his expanded crew like pieces on a chessboard. "They're gaining on us," Elena said quietly, her breath warm against Jake's neck. "Maybe. But they're also making a mistake." Jake studied the search pattern below, his mind working through possibilities and strategies the way he'd learned to think during his years tracking outlaws through these same mountains. "They're assuming we're running scared, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and Redemption Creek. They don't know we might have a reason to go back." Elena shifted behind him. "Go back?" "Jake, that's suicide. The whole town will be crawling with Morrison's men by now." "Which is exactly why it might be the safest place to hide." Jake turned Grace away from the overlook, guiding her toward a narrow trail that switched back down the far side of the mountain. "Think about it, Elena. Rawlings has pulled every gun hand in the territory to hunt us in the wilderness. He's left Redemption Creek relatively undefended because he assumes we're trying to escape, not return. But why would we return? Even if those records are hidden somewhere in town, how could we possibly retrieve them with Morrison's men everywhere?" Jake smiled grimly. "Because I know something Rawlings doesn't. Today is Sunday, and Sunday means everyone in Redemption Creek will be gathered in one place for morning service, including whoever Marcus Holloway trusted with those records." The plan was dangerous to the point of madness, but it was also the kind of bold move that might succeed precisely because no one would expect it. While Rawlings and his small army combed the mountains for fugitives, Jake and Elena would slip back into town, identify the person holding the evidence against Morrison, and retrieve the proof that could save Elena's life and bring justice for 30 murdered children. As they rode, Elena told him more about the records Marcus had kept, detailed lists of children brought from Eastern orphanages, their ages and names, the dates they'd arrived at Morrison's mines, and the dates they'd simply vanished from the payroll. More horrifying still were Marcus's notes about the methods Morrison used to dispose of inconvenient witnesses. Mine cave-ins that weren't accidental. Workers who fell into smelting furnaces during accidents that happened when no other witnesses were present. A systematic campaign of murder that had been going on for years under the cover of legitimate business operations. Marcus was planning to take everything to Federal Marshal William Hayes in Colorado Springs, Elena explained as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of trail. Hayes has a reputation for being incorruptible, someone Morrison's money couldn't buy. But Marcus needed time to gather additional evidence, to build a case so strong that even Morrison's political connections couldn't make it disappear. And you think he gave copies of what he had to someone in Redemption Creek as insurance? I'm sure of it. Marcus was terrified of Morrison, but he was also determined to see justice done. He wouldn't have put all his evidence in one place where it could be stolen or destroyed. Elena was quiet for a moment. Jake, there's something else. Something I should have told you before we left town. Jake felt his stomach clench. More secrets, more complications in a situation that was already impossibly complex. What is it? The night before Marcus was killed, he sent me a telegram. Just 3 words. Trust the shepherd. At the time, I thought he was talking about finding spiritual guidance, maybe suggesting I seek help from a minister. But now you think he was talking about Reverend Patterson? Jake felt pieces clicking together in his mind. Patterson would make sense as someone Marcus would trust. The Reverend knows everyone in town, keeps confidences like a priest, and he's one of the few people in Redemption Creek who doesn't owe his livelihood to mining interests. They were taking an enormous risk by returning to town, but if Patterson had the records, if they could retrieve them and get them to Marshal Hayes in Colorado Springs, then Elena would be vindicated and Morrison would face justice for his crimes. It was worth the gamble. By mid-morning, they had circled back to within a mile of Redemption Creek. Jake left Grace tethered in a grove of aspen trees and proceeded on foot, Elena beside him as they made their way to the ridge that overlooked the town. What they saw below made Jake's blood run cold. Redemption Creek looked like it was under military occupation. Morrison's hired guns were positioned at every major intersection, questioning anyone who tried to enter or leave town. The jail had been turned into a command post, with riders coming and going constantly, carrying reports from the search teams combing the mountains. But most ominous of all was the black carriage parked in front of the hotel, its presence announcing that Thomas Morrison himself had come to Redemption Creek to personally oversee the hunt for his escaped wife. "He's here," Elena whispered, her face pale with terror. "Thomas is actually here." Through the window of the hotel's second-floor suite, Jake could make out a figure in an expensive suit standing at the window, surveying his domain like a king reviewing his army. Thomas Morrison was a tall man with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. Even at this distance, Jake could sense the aura of power and menace that surrounded Morrison like a dark cloud. "Look," Elena said, pointing toward the church. "People are gathering for service." Indeed, despite the military presence in their town, the citizens of Redemption Creek were making their way to Sunday morning worship. Jake could see familiar faces, the banker, the shopkeepers, families with children, all walking toward the white church where Reverend Patterson would soon deliver his weekly sermon. If the records were hidden there, this might be their only chance to retrieve them before Morrison's net closed completely. "We'll wait until service starts," Jake decided. "Then we go in through the back entrance while everyone's focused on the Reverend's sermon. If Patterson has what we need, we get it and get out before anyone knows we were there." But as they watched, a new complication emerged. Curtis Rawlings himself was walking toward the church, accompanied by 2 of his men. They weren't dressed for worship. Their guns were visible, their expressions hard and businesslike. They had the look of men preparing to search the church for evidence or fugitives. "They're going to search during the service," Jake realized. Morrison must have had the same thought we did about Patterson being Marcus's contact. Elena gripped his arm. "If they find the records first..." "They won't." Jake was already moving, working his way down the ridge toward the church. "Because we're going to get there first." The back entrance to the church was through a small vestry where Patterson kept his robes and prepared for services. Jake had been in the room countless times over the years, usually discussing matters of town security with the Reverend before major events. If Marcus had hidden anything in the church, the vestry would be the logical place. Private, secure, accessible only to Patterson and perhaps one or two trusted deacons. As they approached the building, Jake could hear Patterson's voice carrying through the open windows, beginning the opening hymn that traditionally started Sunday service. The congregation was singing along, their voices raised in harmony that seemed to mock the violence and corruption that had invaded their peaceful town. Jake tried the vestry door and found it unlocked. Typical of Patterson's trusting nature and the generally safe atmosphere that had prevailed in Redemption Creek until Morrison's killers arrived. Inside, the small room smelled of candle wax and old wood, sunlight filtering through a single stained glass window that cast rainbow patterns across the simple furnishings. Where would he hide something? Elena asked, scanning the room's contents. A desk, a filing cabinet, shelves lined with religious books and papers. Jake was already examining the desk, looking for hidden compartments or unusual modifications. In his experience, people who hid important documents usually chose locations that were both secure and memorable, places they could find again quickly under stress. "Jake," Elena whispered urgently from beside the filing cabinet, "look at this." She was pointing to a particular drawer that looked different from the others. Newer hardware, a more complex lock mechanism than a simple church filing cabinet would normally require. Jake knelt beside it, examining the lock with the careful attention he'd learned from years of dealing with safes and strong boxes in his law enforcement career. "This has been modified recently," he concluded. "Someone installed a new lock system, something that would keep casual snoopers out, but not be too obvious to anyone who wasn't looking for it." From the main church came the sound of Patterson's voice beginning his sermon, his words about justice and moral courage carrying an ironic weight given their current situation. But that irony was lost on Jake as he focused on the lock, working with a small pick he carried for emergencies. The mechanism yielded after several minutes of careful manipulation, the drawer sliding open to reveal a manila envelope sealed with wax. Written on the outside in Marcus Holloway's careful handwriting was a single name: Marshal William Hayes, urgent. "This is it," Elena breathed, her hands shaking as Jake lifted the envelope from the drawer. "These are Marcus's records, the evidence that will prove everything." But as Jake stood with the precious documents in his hands, a sound from outside froze his blood, the distinctive creak of the vestry door opening behind them. He spun around to find himself face to face with Curtis Rawlings, the killer's gun already drawn and aimed directly at Jake's heart. "Well, well," Rawlings said with a cold smile. "Looks like we had the same idea about where to look. Now why don't you hand over those papers nice and easy, Marshal? Mr. Morrison is very interested in reviewing their contents before anyone else gets a chance to read them." Time slowed to a crawl as Jake stared down the barrel of Curtis Rawlings' Colt .45. The killer's finger was already tightening on the trigger, his cold smile promising a quick death for the troublesome Marshal who'd caused Thomas Morrison so much inconvenience. In that frozen moment, Jake could hear every sound with crystalline clarity. Elena's sharp intake of breath behind him, the congregation singing hymns in the main church, the soft whistle of wind through the vestry's stained glass window. But Jake Sullivan hadn't survived 8 years as a frontier marshal by freezing up in deadly situations. As Rawlings' finger completed its pull on the trigger, Jake dove sideways, tackling Elena to the floor behind Patterson's heavy oak desk, just as the gunshot exploded through the small room. The bullet splintered wood where Jake's chest had been a heartbeat earlier, sending a shower of debris across the vestry floor. The envelope containing Marcus's evidence scattered from Jake's hands, its precious contents spilling across the wooden floor as Jake rolled behind the desk, drawing his own weapon with practiced speed. In the main church, the hymn singing had stopped abruptly, replaced by confused murmurs and the sound of people rising from their pews. "You just made this harder on yourself, Marshal," Rawlings called out, moving to get a better angle around the desk. "Mr. Morrison doesn't like complications, and you're becoming a very expensive complication." Jake risked a quick glance around the desk's edge, spotting Rawlings advancing with his gun raised, ready to finish what he'd started. But the killer had made a crucial mistake. He was so focused on Jake that he'd temporarily forgotten about Elena, who was gathering up the scattered documents with desperate efficiency. "Elena," Jake whispered urgently, "when I move, you run for the side door. Get to the horses and ride for Colorado Springs. Find Marshal Hayes." "I'm not leaving you," she hissed back, clutching the papers to her chest. "You have to. Those records are the only thing that can stop Morrison. They're more important than my life, more important than yours. 30 dead children deserve justice." Before Elena could argue further, Jake made his move. He erupted from behind the desk, firing 3 rapid shots that forced Rawlings to dive for cover behind the filing cabinet. In that moment of confusion, Elena bolted for the side door, the envelope pressed against her body like a shield. But she never made it to the exit. The door burst open to reveal 2 more of Morrison's men, their guns drawn and ready. Elena skidded to a halt, trapped between them and Rawlings, her face pale with the realization that they'd walked into a perfectly orchestrated trap. "Thought we might have company in here," one of the newcomers said with a cruel grin. "Mr. Morrison's been real interested in meeting his wife's new protector." From the main church came the sound of Reverend Patterson's voice, raised in alarm as he tried to calm his frightened congregation. "Please, everyone remain seated. I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding that can be resolved peacefully." Jake knew they had maybe 30 seconds before Morrison's men started using the congregation as hostages to force his surrender. Innocent people, families, children, elderly parishioners who'd never done anything worse than miss a Sunday service, would pay the price for his decision to help Elena. "Marshal Sullivan," Rawlings called out, emboldened now that he had backup. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender now and maybe we can work something out. Keep fighting and a lot of innocent people are going to get hurt." Jake looked at Elena, seeing his own desperation reflected in her eyes. They both knew Rawlings was lying. Morrison couldn't afford to leave any witnesses alive, especially not a federal marshal who'd seen evidence of systematic child murder. The only question was how many innocents would die alongside them. That's when Jake heard something that changed everything. The distinctive sound of multiple riders approaching the church at full gallop. Through the vestry window, he caught a glimpse of blue uniforms and federal badges. Marshal William Hayes himself, arriving with what looked like a full company of federal officers. Elena had seen them too, her eyes widening with sudden hope. But Rawlings and his men were still focused on the standoff inside the vestry, unaware that their entire operation was about to collapse around them. Jake made the hardest decision of his career as a lawman. Instead of continuing the gunfight, he holstered his weapon and stepped out from behind the desk with his hands raised. "You're right, Rawlings. I surrender." The killer's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Smart choice, Marshal. Now tell your lady friend to hand over those papers." "Elena," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying a meaning only she would understand. "Give him the documents." "It's over." Elena stared at him as if he'd lost his mind, but something in his expression must have convinced her to trust his judgment. With trembling hands, she extended the envelope toward Rawlings. "That's more like it," the killer said, reaching for the evidence that would seal Elena's death sentence and bury the truth about Morrison's crimes forever. But as his fingers closed around the envelope, Jake smiled. "You might want to look outside, Rawlings." The killer's eyes flicked toward the window, and his face went white as he saw the federal officers surrounding the church, their rifles aimed at every exit. Marshal Hayes himself was striding toward the front entrance, his badge gleaming in the morning sunlight. "How did you—" Rawlings started to ask. "Telegraph," Jake said simply. "Sent to Marshal Hayes 3 days ago, right after I started investigating Elena's case. Told him about Morrison, about the inconsistencies in the evidence, about everything that didn't add up. Hayes has been gathering his own evidence ever since, waiting for the right moment to move against Morrison and his network." Elena stared at Jake in amazement. "You've been planning this all along?" "Not all of it. But I knew from the beginning that this was bigger than just a murder charge against you. Men like Morrison don't frame innocent women unless they're protecting something much worse." Jake kept his hands raised, but his voice carried the authority of a lawman who just checkmated his opponent. "I also knew that eventually Morrison would make a mistake, get desperate enough to show his hand. Sending hired killers to murder a prisoner in federal custody was exactly the kind of mistake Hayes needed to justify a full investigation. The sound of boots on wooden floors announced the arrival of federal officers in the main church. Hayes's voice could be heard giving orders, deploying his men to secure the building and arrest anyone carrying unauthorized weapons. Rawlings' face twisted with rage as he realized how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. "You think this changes anything? Morrison owns half the territorial government. He'll walk away from this clean." "Maybe," Jake admitted, "but he won't walk away from 30 counts of child murder, and he won't walk away from the testimony of every federal witness Hayes has been gathering for the past week." The vestry door opened to admit Marshal Hayes himself, a tall man with graying temples and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades bringing justice to the lawless frontier. Behind him came 2 federal deputies, their weapons drawn and ready. "Marshal Sullivan," Hayes said with a nod of professional respect, "I received your telegraph about the Morrison situation. Quite an interesting case you've uncovered here." Jake finally lowered his hands. "Marshal Hayes, I'd like you to meet Elena Morrison, the key witness in what I believe is the largest case of systematic murder in territorial history." Elena stepped forward, clutching the envelope containing Marcus's records. "Marshal, my husband Thomas Morrison has been murdering children for years, covering up his crimes through bribery and intimidation. These documents contain proof of at least 30 deaths, maybe more." Hayes took the envelope with the reverence due to evidence that could bring down one of Colorado Territory's most powerful men. "Mrs. Morrison, I want you to know that you're now under federal protection. Mr. Morrison will not be able to harm you or anyone else ever again." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Thomas Morrison himself appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 more federal deputies who had him firmly in custody. Morrison was still dressed in his expensive suit, but his silver hair was disheveled and his face was flushed with the rage of a man unaccustomed to being thwarted. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying the same cold authority that had terrorized her for years, "I see you've been telling stories again. You always were prone to flights of imagination, but Elena Morrison was no longer the frightened woman who'd fled Denver 6 months ago." Standing beside Jake, surrounded by federal officers who would protect her rights instead of Morrison's interests, she faced her husband with a strength that surprised even herself. "They're not stories, Thomas. They're federal crimes, and every one of those murdered children is going to have justice, no matter how much money you have or how many politicians you think you own." Morrison's cold smile never wavered. "We'll see about that. I've beaten worse charges than this with better evidence against me." Marshal Hayes stepped forward, his voice carrying the full weight of federal authority. "Mr. Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, bribery of federal officials, and the murders of approximately 30 children in your mining operations. You have the right to remain silent, though I suspect your lawyers will have plenty to say at your trial." As the federal deputies led Morrison away in shackles, Jake felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he'd been carrying since the day Elena's warrant arrived in Redemption Creek. Justice wasn't just about following orders or enforcing laws written in books. Sometimes it was about standing up for people who had no one else to stand for them, even when doing so meant risking everything you'd worked to build. Elena slipped her hand into his as they watched Morrison disappear into the federal custody that would ensure he never hurt another child again. "Jake, I need you to know something. Whatever happens next, however this all ends, you saved more than just my life. You saved every child who might have been Thomas's next victim." Jake squeezed her hand gently. "We saved them, Elena. All of us. You, Marcus, Hayes, even Reverend Patterson, who kept those records safe. Justice isn't a one-person job." Outside, the people of Redemption Creek were finally free to leave their church, emerging into a world where their marshal had proven that sometimes breaking the law was the most lawful thing a peace officer could do. The real work of healing was just beginning. But for the first time in months, both Jake and Elena could see a future that didn't end in violence or judicial murder. It was, Jake thought, exactly what being a good marshal was supposed to feel like. 6 months after Thomas Morrison's arrest, the territorial courthouse in Denver was packed with spectators who had come to witness the conclusion of what newspapers were calling the trial of the century. Jake Sullivan sat in the front row, his Marshal's badge polished to a shine, watching as Elena took the witness stand for the final day of testimony that would determine Morrison's fate. She looked different now than the frightened woman who'd knelt in the dust of Redemption Creek's main street with a death warrant hanging over her head. Elena Morrison, she legally reclaimed her maiden name of Vasquez, wore a simple blue dress and spoke with the clear, steady voice of someone who had finally found the courage to tell the truth without fear. Mr. Morrison controlled every aspect of my life through violence and intimidation, she testified, looking directly at the jury. But his greatest crime wasn't what he did to me. It was what he did to children who had no one to protect them, no one to speak for them when they disappeared into his minds and never came out. At the defendant's table, Thomas Morrison sat in expensive clothes that couldn't hide the fact that he was just another criminal facing justice for his crimes. His team of high-priced lawyers had spent weeks trying to discredit Elena's testimony, to paint Marcus Holloway's meticulously kept records as fabrications, to convince the jury that Morrison was the victim of a conspiracy by disgruntled business rivals. None of it had worked. The evidence was too overwhelming, too detailed, too corroborated by federal investigators who had spent months uncovering the full scope of Morrison's criminal empire. Mining supervisors who had kept silent for years about accidents that weren't accidents. Foremen who testified about being ordered to dispose of children's bodies in abandoned mine shafts. Accountants who had falsified payroll records to hide the systematic murder of underage workers. But perhaps the most damning evidence had come from Morrison himself. Federal agents searching his Denver mansion had found a private safe containing detailed records of every bribe he'd paid, every official he'd corrupted, every witness he'd silenced. Morrison's obsessive need to document his power had become the instrument of his destruction. As Elena finished her testimony and stepped down from the witness stand, Jake felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Marshal William Hayes settling into the seat beside him, the federal officer's face showing the satisfaction of a lawman who had seen justice served. "Hell of a thing you did in Redemption Creek," Hayes said quietly. "Takes real courage to throw away 8 years of perfect service record to save an innocent woman." Jake shrugged. Wasn't throwing it away. Was finally figuring out what it was supposed to be used for. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their verdict. Thomas Morrison, once one of the most powerful men in Colorado Territory, was found guilty on all 37 counts of murder, plus additional charges of racketeering, bribery, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to hang, a fate that Morrison met with the same cold arrogance he'd shown throughout the trial. But for Jake, the real victory wasn't Morrison's conviction. It was watching Elena walk out of that courthouse, a free woman, her head held high, ready to begin the life that had been stolen from her for so many years. They were married 3 weeks later in the same church where they'd retrieved Marcus Holloway's evidence, with Reverend Patterson performing the ceremony before a congregation that included half the population of Redemption Creek. Elena wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her by the town seamstress, and Jake wore his best suit with his Marshal's badge pinned proudly to the lapel. Marshal Hayes served as best man, and in his toast at the reception, he raised his glass to a lawman who proved that sometimes the most important law is the one written in the human heart. But it was Elena's maid of honor who brought tears to every eye in the church social hall, Sarah Mitchell, a 15-year-old girl who had survived Thomas Morrison's mines and lived to testify at his trial. Sarah had been one of the disappeared children, presumed dead until federal investigators found her working in near-slavery conditions at a remote mining camp. Her rescue had led to the discovery of 17 other children who had been reported dead, but were actually being held as unpaid laborers. "Mrs. Elena saved all of us," Sarah said in her toast, her young voice carrying the weight of experiences no child should have endured. She could have stayed quiet, stayed safe, but she chose to speak for those of us who couldn't speak for ourselves. As the reception continued into the evening, Jake found himself standing on the church steps with Elena, looking out over the town that had become their home. Redemption Creek had changed in the months since Morrison's arrest. The mining interests that had dominated local politics were under federal investigation, and new businesses were moving in, legitimate enterprises that offered fair wages and safe working conditions. Do you ever regret it? Elena asked, slipping her arm through his. Giving up your perfect record as a by-the-books marshal? Jake considered the question seriously. His superiors in territorial law enforcement had ultimately commended his actions in the Morrison case, but there were still those who questioned whether a marshal should ever disobey a warrant, regardless of the circumstances. His reputation would always carry the mark of someone who had chosen conscience over protocol. No regrets, he said finally. I spent 8 years thinking that being a good marshal meant following orders without question. But orders come from people, and people can be corrupted. Justice, that comes from something higher. Elena smiled, the same smile that had caught his attention 6 months ago when she was just a school teacher trying to bring education to a rough frontier town. Marcus would be proud of what we accomplished. All those children who will grow up safe because someone finally stood up to Thomas Morrison. As if summoned by her words, Sarah Mitchell appeared beside them, still wearing her bridesmaid's dress, but with the serious expression of someone far older than her years. Marshal Sullivan, she said formally, I wanted to thank you properly, not just for saving Mrs. Elena, but for proving that there are still lawmen who care more about protecting people than protecting their careers. Jake knelt down so he could look Sarah in the eye. Sarah, you don't need to thank me. You survived something that would have broken grown men. You found the courage to testify against one of the most powerful men in the territory. That took more bravery than anything I did. Maybe, Sarah said with a small smile, but you gave me the chance to use that bravery. That's worth everything. As the young girl rejoined the celebration inside, Jake and Elena remained on the church steps, watching the sun set over the Colorado mountains. The future stretched before them, challenging, uncertain, but filled with possibilities that hadn't existed when Elena was a fugitive and Jake was a marshal torn between duty and conscience. What happens now? Elena asked. Do we stay in Redemption Creek? Do you keep being marshal? Jake had been thinking about that question for weeks. The territorial governor had offered him a promotion, a chance to become a federal marshal like Hayes, to take his talents to bigger cases in more important towns. It was the kind of opportunity he'd dreamed about for years, but looking out over Redemption Creek, seeing the peaceful town that had become their home, Jake realized that importance wasn't measured in the size of the badge or the prestige of the position. I think we stay, he said. This town needs a marshal who understands that law and justice aren't always the same thing, and I need to be somewhere that reminds me every day why I pinned on this badge in the first place. Elena leaned against his shoulder, and they stood together in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were still Morrison associates under investigation, still children being reunited with families, still the long work of rebuilding trust in institutions that had been corrupted by greed and power. But tonight was for celebrating the victory of justice over law, of conscience over protocol, of love over fear. Inside the church, the reception continued with music and laughter that carried on the evening breeze. Jake could hear Reverend Patterson leading the crowd in a song of thanksgiving, Marshal Hayes telling stories about the investigation that had brought down Morrison's empire, and Sarah Mitchell laughing with the other children. The sound of innocence reclaimed and protected. Jake, Elena said softly, I have something to tell you. He looked down at her, seeing something in her eyes that made his heart skip a beat. I'm pregnant, she said simply. Dr. Morrison confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby. Jake felt the world shift around him, everything suddenly brighter and more meaningful than it had been a moment before. A child, their child. A new life that would grow up in a world where Thomas Morrison could never hurt another innocent person. Are you happy? Elena asked, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. Jake swept her into his arms, spinning her around on the church steps while she laughed with pure joy. When he finally set her down, his answer came from the deepest part of his heart. Elena Sullivan, I've never been happier in my life. Our child is going to grow up in a town where the marshal knows the difference between law and justice, where people stand up for what's right even when it's dangerous, where love is stronger than fear. As they walked back into the church to share their news with the celebrating crowd, Jake realized that this was what redemption really meant. Not just the name of their town, but the second chance that life offered to those brave enough to choose right over easy, Justice over convenience. Love over law. The badge on his chest caught the lamplight as they entered the church, but it no longer felt like a burden or a symbol of rigid authority. It felt like what it had always been meant to be, a promise to protect those who needed protection, to serve those who deserved justice, and to remember that the most important laws were the ones written in the human heart. Marshal Jake Sullivan had finally learned what it truly meant to serve and protect. And so ends the remarkable true story of Marshal Jake Sullivan and Elena Vasquez, a tale that reminds us that sometimes the greatest act of law enforcement is knowing when to break the rules. History would remember Jake Sullivan not as the marshal who defied a federal warrant, but as the lawman who saved 37 innocent lives and brought down one of the most corrupt criminal enterprises in Colorado Territory's history. His decision to choose conscience over protocol inspired a new generation of peace officers who understood that their duty was to people, not just paperwork. Elena Sullivan became a powerful advocate for children's rights, working with federal authorities to establish new protections for young workers throughout the American frontier. The school she founded in Redemption Creek became a model for education reform across the West, proving that even in the roughest territories, knowledge and compassion could triumph over ignorance and greed. Thomas Morrison was executed on a cold January morning in 1883, but his death could never truly balance the scales for the children whose lives he had stolen. The real justice came from the lives that were saved, the corruption that was exposed, and the system that was forced to change because one honest marshal refused to look the other way. The story of Jake and Elena spread throughout the frontier territories, becoming the kind of legend that cowboys told around campfires and mothers shared with their children. It was a story about the courage to do what's right even when the whole world tells you it's wrong, about love that's strong enough to challenge injustice, about the difference between following orders and serving justice. Their son, Marcus Sullivan, named for the brave banker who had started it all, grew up to become a federal judge who spent his career protecting the rights of those who couldn't protect themselves. He often said that his greatest inheritance wasn't money or property, but the example his parents had set of choosing love over law, justice over convenience, and courage over fear. Redemption Creek still stands today, a thriving town where the marshal's office bears a bronze plaque commemorating Jake Sullivan's service. The inscription reads simply, "He served justice, not just the law." But perhaps the most fitting memorial to their story is found in the church where Jake and Elena were married, where Marcus Holloway's evidence was hidden, where justice finally caught up with Thomas Morrison's evil. In the stained glass window behind the altar, added by the congregation in 1884, an image shows a marshal's badge surrounded by the faces of children, a reminder that true law enforcement means protecting the innocent, no matter the cost. This is the legacy of the Wild West. Not just gunfights and gold rushes, but ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things when faced with impossible choices. Stories of love conquering hate, justice overcoming corruption, and hope prevailing against all odds. If this story moved you, remember that history is filled with unsung heroes who chose conscience over convenience, who stood up for what was right even when it meant losing everything. Their courage lives on in every person who refuses to stay silent in the face of injustice. The frontier may be gone, but the choice between law and justice, between fear and love, between right and wrong, that choice remains as relevant today as it was in Jake Sullivan's time. Because sometimes the most important badge a person can wear isn't made of metal, it's made of moral courage. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories for more incredible tales from America's frontier. Like this video if Jake and Elena's story touched your heart. Comment below. What would you have done in Jake's position? Law or justice? Thank you for joining us on this journey through the untamed heart of the American West, where love was stronger than law and justice was worth any sacrifice.